I'm sure you've had the discussion with your friends at some point. Why are flats getting so expensive? It doesn't matter if you live in Los Angeles, San Francisco, or London. We're talking about a really global problem. Then again, we should first question, is this actually a problem at all, or is it just, basic economics? Whatever it is, we're talking about a phenomenon that's happening in all the big metropolises. For example, in the city of Los Angeles, the average rent has risen 15% in the last 3 years. And let's be honest here, if you have a decent salary, this is really more of an inconvenience than it is a real problem. But let's imagine that you're a shop assistant in LA. Even better, let's imagine that Xander is a shop assistant in LA. What would happen to you, Xander?
If I were a shop assistant in Los Angeles, I would probably be making around $2,000 a month. 540 square foot studio apartment in South LA, which is a very cheap neighborhood, can cost about $1,200 a month. This would mean that 60% of my pre-tax salary would go to rent. The rest would go to basic needs like food and clothing. So, yes, I would have a hard time saving money with that salary.
Now, in an ideal situation, you would only spend about a third of your salary on your rent or mortgage, so you'd have enough to live comfortably and to save some money. Spending 60% of your income on rent means that just a small increase in prices could knock you below the poverty line. And yes, that risk is a lot more real than you might want to believe.
Los Angeles homeless population hits 36,000 in dramatic rise.
But this is not the end of the story. I mean, think about this. Here at VisualPolitik, we always say that the world is getting bigger. We're wealthier, we're healthier, and we have better lifestyles. And this is partly because stuff is actually getting cheaper. Here's an example. During the 1970s, only 20% of Americans had ever flown on a plane. Why? Well, because between Los Angeles and New York, the trip would cost you 1,500 of today's dollars. Now, this very same flight, it only costs 200. Thanks to this, I'm sure most of you watching have already traveled more than your grandparents did in their entire lifetimes. The same goes for other goods. Everything is becoming more and more affordable, except houses. No matter if you rent or if you buy, you have to make the same, if not more, sacrifices than your grandparents' generation. Today in Stockholm, there are people living in 150 square feet flats. In fact, it's not uncommon to meet couples in Sweden who want to divorce but are waiting for their spouse to find another flat. But the real question here is, why are flat rentals going so sky high? Can we solve this problem with better policies? Well, today we're going to answer these questions, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
Supply, demand, and the rest.
It is a universal and logical fact. The population grows in every country. Just a decade ago, America had 300 million people. Now they have 27 million more. But not all cities grow equally. If you're watching this video from Detroit or Cleveland, you've probably noticed that there are less and less people around. Most of your friends, they're leaving the city. And where are they going? Yep, they're going to cities like LA or New York. So what does that mean? It means that the demand for living in those cities keeps getting higher. This is totally okay, and it is natural. But here is the real problem. If we're talking about a normal market, supply can rise to satisfy that demand. For an example, let's look at oil markets. We've told you a million times here at VisualPolitik how Saudi Arabia decreases or increases its oil barrel production depending on the market's needs. It's easy. They can increase production from one month to the other. But when it comes to real estate, increasing supply means building more houses, and this takes time. Besides, the investment for a new block of flats is huge, and the profit margins are around 3%. And the truth is that we need many, many houses to cover demand.
California would need to build 3.5 million housing units by 2025 to close its housing gap. Extract from a report from McKinsey Global Institute, October 2016.
But why do developers have so many problems building homes? I mean, we're talking basic economics here. It would seem that if you entered the housing building industry, you'd do pretty well in California. Well, of course you would, but there's one problem, and that's zoning laws. You see, the real estate market is actually tightly regulated by City Hall. If you want to build in LA, you need a permit that can take more than 3 years to get. And all of this happens because city corporations are the ones who choose where and how to build. So So how does City Hall know how many dwellings they need? Well, mainly they look at population growth. If you check the data, you'll see that the housing census in LA has mirrored its demographic growth. And although it makes sense on the surface, this is a huge mistake. Because population is one thing, demand is another. For example, imagine a couple who lives in one house. If they get divorced, all of a sudden they need an extra house. So, well, there you go. Same population, but we just created twice as much demand. And the reality is that we have a higher and higher single and divorced population. This is not happening just in Los Angeles, but also in Madrid, in Berlin, and almost every other city. Many experts say that the solution is to build more houses. Others advocate for abolishing zoning laws. But in Europe, many cities bet on price controls. So do you think these policies are working? Is it a good or is it a bad idea? Well, let's have a look, shall we?
The other Stockholm syndrome.
Usually when we talk about Sweden, it's because we're using them as a model. Swedish people enjoy a large welfare state alongside a dynamic economy with innovative companies. Among those is Europe's most famous startup, even though it might not stay in Sweden for that much longer. Check this out.
Spotify's threats to leave Sweden spur startup protest in Stockholm.
And at this point you might be thinking, well, come on, Simon. Everyone knows that Sweden is pretty open to immigrants, and, well, yes, they are, but good luck moving to Stockholm and finding a flat. While we were making this video, we actually spoke to a man who worked for a Swedish startup for a year and a half. He made a salary of 2,900 euros a month, but more than a half of that went towards paying rent on a 500 square foot flat. And believe me, this was not the worst case. Finding a flat in Stockholm is so hard that some people spend months in an AirBNB. And so now you might be wondering, well, why? Okay, so it all started in the 1950s. Sweden needed houses, so the Social Democratic government created the Million Houses policy. The idea was to build public houses for rent at very cheap prices. During those early years, every Swedish person could apply for a public house and pay rent at prices equivalent to 400 or 300 euros today. But things changed in the 1990s. During those years, Sweden suffered one of the worst debt crises in their history. No money, no more houses. But the rent regulations, they still remained. So either you went for a public house or you had to find a place in an extremely scarce rental market. Basically in Sweden, they have the so-called first-hand market. Those are the public houses.
If you're Swedish, the first thing you do when you turn 18 is to apply there. If you're lucky, in 13 or 16 years, there's a 2-bedroom apartment waiting for you for just 600 euros a month. In other words, what you don't pay with money, you pay with time. This explains why 25% of the Swedes stay with their parents until they turn 30.
And it also explains why the society is turning from renting to owning. With lower rates for mortgages, most Swedes buy as soon as they can. But the real question is, what happens to people who weren't born in Sweden? What happens if you just moved there and have no family to stay with? Well, in that case, welcome to the wonderful world of the second-hand market. Basically, Sweden believes that you shouldn't make money from renting. The law has lots of ways to ban people from renting, and long-term rentals are forbidden. But even if you had a tenant for a 1-year contract, the community of your building can deny you permission. Yep, you heard that right. Your neighbors can essentially say that you can't rent your place out or that you have to kick out your tenant. This explains why, with so many restrictions, there are almost no available flats. So despite the great welfare system, many people live in 200 square feet flats. But again, the worst problem is not the inconvenience. It's this.
Sweden probes riot in mainly immigrant Stockholm suburb.
Exactly. The poor immigrants have no capital to find a flat, and they have to go to the worst neighborhoods. And this is how ghettos form. And yes, okay, I know you've all seen those conspiracy videos where they exaggerate the gang violence in Sweden, but let's be honest, even though the problem is not as big as some media portrays, Sweden does have a clear problem with criminality. But we'll talk about this in a future video. In the meantime, if you're enjoying this video so far, do remember we publish brand new videos every week, so subscribe to VisualPolitik and hit that bell button so you receive a notification on your phone anytime we post. That would be nice. But let's get back to our story. Of course, this Stockholm crisis could be solved by building more houses, but even if you built 80,000 new dwellings a year, as many have suggested, you'd also badly need to change those renting laws. So now you might be thinking, all right, Simon, well, now we've been waiting. It's time for you to tell us the magical solution. Is there any example of a city that has solved this renting problem? And the answer is yes. So let's check it out, shall we?
rent-for-all system.
Austria is one of Europe's wealthiest countries. The average salary here is over 2,700 euros a month. And if you live in Vienna, it's not hard to find jobs that are paying more than 3,500 euros a month. Nevertheless, rent costs are the same as a way poorer city like Madrid, Spain. For 1,500 euros, you can find an amazing 860 square foot flat in the center of the city. And I know what you're thinking, oh, come on, now the guys of VisualPolitik are going to tell me another story about how a city embraced the free market with no remorse and lived happily ever after, right? Well, no, actually the opposite is true. Basically, the Vienna Council is something like a developer and a rental agency at the same time. They are the city's biggest landlord. You see, after World War II, half of Vienna ended up completely devastated by the bombing. So the city hall paid for all of the reconstruction. That's when they said, hold on a minute, since we paid for all of this, aren't we entitled to rent it out under our own conditions? And this is how the world's most ambitious public program started. Here's how it works. 80% of people in Vienna live in rental flats. 60% of those live in public housing. Some of the buildings are from cooperatives and others belong to City Hall. But hold on a minute, because we're not talking about normal rental agreements here. In fact, we could call them something just short of limited property. Basically, rent contracts in Vienna, they last forever, even if you're dead. Yep, rental contracts can be inherited. So long as you don't move, you can stay and the flat is yours. And, well, you should see these houses. In America and the UK, we have this notion that public housing is for the poor and that it's in bad neighborhoods. But here, you can find public houses even in the best neighborhoods, and they're pretty amazing. The swimming pools, gyms, even saunas. In some cases, it gets really absurd. While we were doing the research for this video, we spoke to Vienna City Hall and they gave us a lot of cases. For example, there's a young woman who lives in an 860 square foot apartment in the city center. How much do you think she pays for it? Well, yep, only 400 euros a month. That's less than $500. But her neighbor, living in a similar flat, pays 2,000 euros. Why? Well, he lives in one of the apartments that aren't public. So just like in Stockholm, Vienna has two types of renting: controlled prices and free prices. And so now you might be wondering, well, how come they don't have waiting lists? Well, here's your answer.
Annually, Vienna spends about 600 million euros, or $682 million, on social housing. In comparison, Germany, with a population over 45 times Vienna, spends about 400 million euros nationwide.
So you've got to be wondering now, well, how does the system work? Let's say you move to Vienna. In the first few years, you can't apply for public housing, but no problem, there are more than 290,000 flats on the free market. So it's not that hard to find a place, and the prices aren't crazy because there's a large supply. Then, after only 2 or 3 years, you can apply for a public house. Depending on your family status, your income, and your pickiness, it might be easier or harder for you to find a home. But usually we're talking about waiting times of no more than 2 years. Of course, as we always say on VisualPolitik, not everything is sunshine and rainbows. The first issue with this system is that you don't want to move out of your flat once you find it. This model pretty much reduces your freedom to choose. Basically, it's not you who gets to choose, but rather City Hall. And remember that your house determines many things about your lifestyle. But there is another issue here, and that's sustainability. This system relies heavily on just one actor, the municipal corporation. This means that as long as the local government has the money, there's no problem, but they just need one crisis and there will be no more houses. And since there aren't many private developers because there are no incentives, they could easily end up with a housing shortage situation. And this would lead to a lot of problems. But we do have to admit that so far, this model does seem to be working. So the question now, of course, becomes, would it be possible to combine the Vienna model with a more free market solution? Do you think this system could be applied in other cities as well? And would you mind renting the same flat for your entire life if the conditions were good enough? Please leave your answer in the comments section below. Before finishing, let me give a special thanks to Mark Solo and Jamie Chapinal for helping us with the facts on Stockholm. Also, let me thank Vienna City Hall for answering all of our questions. They were extremely nice. Don't forget to visit our friends at ReconsiderMedia.com as well. They're the podcast that provided the vocals in this episode. And of course, remember we publish brand new videos every week, so subscribe to VisualPolitik, hit that bell button, give us a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.